Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Let me give you a few things that people may not be aware of. The first is that the middle-class society I grew up in did not evolve gradually. You might think that there was the era of the robber barons, and then gradually America turned into the America of Ozzie and Harriet, whatever, that it gradually evolved into this middle-class society. That is not what the data or the available stories tell us. What they tell us is, in fact, that as far as we can tell, the Gilded Age lasted right through the 1920s. America, on the eve of the New Deal, was very nearly as unequal as it had been in the 1890s. And that the middle-class, relatively egalitarian society was created in a very short period of time between the late 1930s and the end of World War II. The economic historians call it the Great Compression, because the income differences got compressed. And it's as important a story about 20th century America as the Great Depression, which we all know about, though it's much less told. And you look at what happened, and it was the Roosevelt administration, through a whole set of policies, but all of them equalizing. Much higher tax rates on the wealthy, higher corporate tax rates, a pro-union organizing environment, so you had an explosion in union membership, tripling of the share of the workforce, the minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, all of these things. And then the process accelerated because during World War II, there were extensive government controls on the economy, which were used in a way that tended to equalize incomes. All of this created a middle-class society in a period of not more than about 7 or 8 years. Now, you might have thought, well, okay, but this was all artificial, especially the stuff during the war, so it would go away as soon as peacetime returned, but it didn't. It turns out that once you create institutions, norms, expectations of a relatively equal society, it tends to persist. So the income distribution, this relatively middle-class society that was created by the New Deal, persisted for more than a generation after World War II. Then it started to come apart, and you see this dramatic increase in inequality, not quite as fast as the Great Compression, but this dramatic increase starting around 1980, which in itself is kind of an interesting date because that's Reagan comes to the White House. And it turns out that the increase in inequality in the United States is unique to the United States. So other advanced countries have not seen anything like it. The closest thing you can see to the U.S., to this unequalization that's taken place in the United States is in Britain during the Thatcher years, which again is itself a little bit revealing. And nothing remotely. You just look at the charts, and we are off the charts in terms of this increase in inequality. And many of the things that we take for granted as, well, this is the way things work in the late 20th, early 21st century economy, turn out to be special to the U.S. So one example I like to use is the decline of the union movement. We all know that unions are outmoded and you can't, it's global competition and all that. Except, well, here's a comparison people don't know. In the 1960s, Canada, that's the country up there. They almost speak the same language, eh? But anyway, in the 1960s, Canada and the United States had roughly the same percentage of their workers in unions, about 30% in both countries. Today, Canada still has almost 30% of its workers in unions. In the United States, it's down to about 11%, and much less than that, it's in the private sector. It's heavily a public sector thing left. So the deunionization was not something that happened because of the global economy, because Canada faces the same global economy we do. It was something that happened here. And how did it happen? Well, when you look into it closely, you discover that it was political. Basically, Ronald Reagan, above all, though it started before him, declared open season for union busters. During the 1980s, about 1 in every 20 workers who voted for a union was illegally fired. And the reason, sure, we're less of an industrial society, but there's no inherent reason why giant service sector companies, the iconic corporation of the 60s was General Motors, the iconic corporation of today is Walmart. There's no inherent reason why those companies should not be unionized. In fact, similar enterprises are in the rest of the world, but because the shift to a service economy took place in an environment in which politicians, the dominant political forces, said it was okay to bust unions in the way that people had in the 1920s, we've had this dramatic decline in unionization in the United States. So it is not, and that in turn has all kinds of ramifications for the income distribution. So I can talk about it at some length, but there's a lot of reason to believe that politics has driven this dramatic increase in inequality. Sure, technology is there, globalization is there, but it is very largely political. I should say one more thing. There's a view on inequality that you hear all the time, which is, well, it's all about the increased demand for skills for education in the modern world economy. And there's no doubt something to that, but if you actually look at the numbers, the huge growth in disparities has not been between the college-educated and the non-college educated. Yes, people with college degrees have done better than people without, but most of the increase is among people with a lot of education. So that most dramatic statistic, high school teachers tend to have postgraduate degrees, and so do hedge fund managers. And as we all know, last year the highest paid hedge fund manager in the United States made an amount equal to the salaries of all 80,000 New York City school teachers for the next 3 years. So it's not education that is driving this. It's not that simple.